The televised public forum fell silent as actor Jonathan Roumie rose from his chair, his eyes locked on lawyer and political commentator Ben Shapiro across the stage. For the past hour, Shapiro had been dissecting societal issues with his trademark rapid-fire logical precision, dismissing any argument not rooted in strict legal interpretation or empirical data, as if his opponents were ill-prepared students. But what Roumie said next would leave the seasoned commentators speechless and send shockwaves through the entire media establishment. Mr. Shapiro, Roumie's voice cut through the tension like a blade, calm yet resonant. You talk about the law like it's a sterile equation, but you seem to forget who actually has to live under the legal theories you so eloquently defend. The room went dead quiet. Shapiro's confident smirk vanished. Camera phones shot up around the gallery. This wasn't going to be just another intellectual sparring match. This was about to become the cultural moment that would define both their public personas. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these explosive cultural moments. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The tension in that room was electric. You could feel it through the screen. Roumie had just thrown down the gauntlet to one of the most experienced and articulate legal minds in American media, and everyone knew this was about to get intense. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two public figures are and why their clash represents something much bigger than just a panel discussion disagreement. Ben Shapiro had walked into that forum with the confidence of someone who'd been dominating intellectual debates for over 2 decades. At 40, the American lawyer and political commentator had built his entire public identity around being an incisive legal and constitutional interpreter. Harvard Law School graduate, successful author, and host of one of the nation's most popular conservative podcasts, Shapiro wasn't just any commentator. He was the guy other conservatives turned to when they needed someone to explain why their positions were logically sound and constitutionally justified. For years, Shapiro had dominated these public discussions with his methodical, professorial approach. He'd quote legal precedents, cite historical context, and systematically dismantle his opponent's arguments with the precision of a trained litigator. Those who dared to bring up feelings or empathy were his favorite targets. He'd talk down to them, question their understanding of basic logic or legal principles, and often leave them fumbling for responses. Shapiro represented a powerful intellectual guard, experienced, credentialed, and absolutely convinced that his years of study and rigorous debate gave him the moral and intellectual authority to lecture anyone who disagreed with him. He'd come into this forum expecting another easy victory over what he probably saw as an actor, a performer who was in way over his head in a discussion of serious legal and societal principles. But Jonathan Roumie was nothing like what Shapiro expected. The 49-year-old American actor had made a global name for himself portraying Jesus in The Chosen, bringing a profound sense of humanity and compassion to a role that resonated with millions. Before his breakout role, he'd spent years honing his craft, connecting with stories and emotions that spoke to the human condition. Roumie wasn't just another public figure reading from prepared talking points. He was an artist who knew how to connect with an audience, a storyteller who had spent years embodying characters facing profound moral and ethical dilemmas. He'd built his career on moments exactly like this one, where someone with more academic experience and intellectual credentials thought they could intimidate him into silence. What made this confrontation so significant was what it represented. This wasn't just about one policy or one legal interpretation. This was about the clash of intellectual authority versus moral authority, the letter of the law versus the spirit of humanity, and the mind versus the heart in public discourse. Shapiro represented the establishment of intellectual rigor, the idea that logic, credentials, and traditional academic authority should automatically command respect. Roumie represented a new wave, public figures who believed that lived experience, even through the lens of art and empathy, connection to human suffering, and a refusal to be intimidated, mattered more than fancy degrees or years of debate. The forum was supposedly about the intersection of law and empathy in modern society, but everyone in that room knew it was really about power. Shapiro had been systematically dismantling the arguments of other panelists for hours, using his legal expertise and rhetorical skill to make them look unprepared and out of their depth. The conservative strategy was clear. Make those advocating for more empathetic, less strictly legalistic approaches seem naive, emotional, and intellectually inferior. If Shapiro succeeded in doing the same thing to Roumie, it wouldn't just be another debate victory. It would cement the narrative that public figures who prioritize feeling over facts were all flash and no substance, unable to stand up to serious intellectual scrutiny from experienced commentators. But if Roumie could hold his own, or better yet, turn the tables on Shapiro, it would send a message that the old ways of doing public discourse were changing. That intellectual credentials didn't automatically win arguments anymore. That maybe, just maybe, the people who actually experienced the impact of these legal theories deserved as much respect as the people who wrote scholarly articles about them. The entire forum could feel the tension building. This wasn't going to be a normal policy discussion. This was going to be a battle for the soul of American public discourse. And everyone was about to witness either Roumie's public destruction or Shapiro's most humiliating debate defeat in years. The first sign that this wasn't going to be a typical discussion came when Shapiro opened his questioning with what had become his signature move, the logical lecture disguised as a question. "Mr. Roumie," Shapiro began, adjusting his microphone and speaking in that rapid, precise tone that suggested he was about to educate someone who clearly needed it. "I've been reviewing your public statements about the need for greater empathy in our legal system, and I have to say I'm concerned about some fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of law that seem to be driving your position." The room bristled. Shapiro wasn't asking a question. He was delivering a verdict. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was exactly how Shapiro had dismantled other panelists earlier in the day, by questioning not just their positions, but their basic competence to even participate in serious intellectual discussions. Shapiro continued, pulling out a tablet. "The law is very clear about its purpose: to establish a framework for order, justice, and the protection of rights based on defined principles, not subjective emotions. Now, I understand that as an actor, your work is primarily concerned with human emotions and narratives, but surely you can see how attempting to infuse raw empathy into legal interpretation directly contradicts established jurisprudence." The condescension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Shapiro had just accomplished three things in one question. He'd positioned himself as the intellectual authority, suggested that Roumie was too inexperienced in legal matters to understand the issues, and framed his entire empathetic approach as fundamentally flawed. Around the forum, conservative pundits were already preparing social media clips. This looked like it was going to be another Shapiro masterclass in dismantling progressive arguments. But Roumie didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "Mr. Shapiro, I appreciate your concern for my legal education. But before we discuss the cold logic of jurisprudence, perhaps we should talk about the human impact of the law you seem to be reading from versus the one that actually affects people's lives." The first crack in Shapiro's composure appeared, just a slight tightening around his eyes. This wasn't the defensive, flustered response he was expecting. Sensing that his opening gambit hadn't landed as expected, Shapiro decided to escalate. He opened his tablet and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared attack. "Mr. Roumie, let me be more specific. You've argued that a legal system devoid of empathy fails its people, but this demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the law's objective nature. Legal principles are universal and constant, regardless of individual feelings. The great legal philosophers have always stressed the importance of objective reason over subjective emotion. Are you suggesting that centuries of legal thought are wrong?" It was a classic Shapiro move. Hide behind the authority of established thought to make disagreement seem like disagreement with reason itself. He'd used similar tactics to shut down other debaters throughout the forum. The implication was clear. If you disagree with Shapiro's interpretation, you're disagreeing with the very foundations of rational thought. Several people in the gallery leaned forward. This was the moment where most of Shapiro's previous targets had stumbled. How do you argue against centuries of legal philosophy without looking like you're attacking the foundations of ordered society? But Roumie was ready. "Mr. Shapiro, since you're quoting great thinkers, let's talk about what they also believed. Many philosophers, from ancient to modern, have wrestled with the concept of justice, which often includes a strong moral and ethical component, not just a logical one. How do you reconcile your selective reading of legal philosophy with the fact that humanity's understanding of justice has evolved over centuries, often driven by a growing capacity for empathy?" Shapiro's tablet snapped shut a little too quickly. Roumie had just done something none of his other targets had managed. He'd quoted intellectual thought right back at him, and in a way that supported his position rather than Shapiro's. Realizing that academic citations weren't working, Shapiro shifted tactics. He leaned back in his chair and adopted what his colleagues knew was his disappointed professor voice, the tone he used when he wanted to suggest that someone was being willfully obtuse. Mr. Roumie, I think what we're seeing here is exactly why serious intellectual rigor matters in these discussions. You're a talented actor, I'm sure, but legal principles and societal frameworks require years of study, deep understanding of logical structures, and frankly, a level of expertise that comes from more than just portraying characters on a screen or appealing to subjective emotions. The insult was clear, even wrapped in polite language. Shapiro was essentially saying that Roumie was unqualified to even discuss serious legal and societal issues with him. It was a devastating attack because it wasn't just about this one issue. It was about his fundamental right to be taken seriously as a public intellectual. The forum went quiet. Conservative audience members were nodding approvingly. This was vintage Shapiro, using his credentials and intellectual prowess to establish dominance. Several audience members who favored Roumie looked worried. Shapiro had just questioned not just Roumie's position, but his basic qualifications to hold his office. But instead of getting defensive, Roumie smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile that an artist gets when their opponent has just walked into a trap they'd been setting for the last hour. "Mr. Shapiro," Roumie said, his voice steady, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "I find it interesting that you want to talk about qualifications and experience, because you're absolutely right that experience matters. The question is, experience doing what?" He paused, letting that sink in. Around the room, people were starting to sense that something had shifted. Shapiro's confident posture had become slightly more rigid. Roumie was no longer responding to his attacks. He was driving the conversation. "You talk about years of legal study, and that's impressive. But I'm curious, in all those years of studying legal theory, how much time have you spent with the people who actually have to live under the laws we make, or the policies you advocate for? How many individuals have you truly looked into the eyes of, whose lives are irrevocably altered by a legal interpretation that prioritizes abstract logic over tangible human suffering? How many stories have you truly absorbed about people who've been denied justice? Not because the law was unclear, but because the system was designed to be cold and unforgiving?" The room was dead silent now. Roumie had just flipped the script entirely. Instead of defending his qualifications, he was questioning Shapiro's. Instead of playing defense on intellectual theory, he was going on offense about real-world impact and human experience. Shapiro tried to interrupt, but Roumie wasn't finished. "Because here's what I've learned in my years of experience, Mr. Shapiro. Intellectual theory is important, but it's meaningless if it doesn't protect real people. And sometimes the people who spend the most time studying the law in their ivory towers are the ones who understand the least about what it actually means to the Americans who need its protections most." The tension in the room was now crackling. Shapiro's face had gone from confident to confused to slightly red. Roumie had just accused him of being out of touch with real Americans and done it in a way that turned his greatest strength, his intellectual expertise, into a potential weakness. But this was still just the setup. The real knockout punch was coming, and everyone in that room was about to witness public discourse history. What happened next would be replayed millions of times on social media and talked about in political and cultural circles for years to come. Shapiro, rattled by Roumie's unexpected offensive, made a critical error. He decided to go personal. "Mr. Roumie," Shapiro said, his voice now carrying an edge of frustration, "I think what you're really showing here is exactly why we need experienced legal minds in these discussions. You can talk about real people and suffering all you want, but at the end of the day, the law means what it means, not what we want it to mean. And frankly, your emotional appeals don't change centuries of established legal precedent." He paused, thinking he was landing a decisive blow. "This isn't about feelings, Mr. Roumie. This is about law, and the law requires precision, knowledge, and yes, experience. Something that comes from years of serious study, not just good intentions and artistic interpretations." The room went cold. Shapiro had just dismissed everything Roumie had said as emotional appeals and feelings, a classic way of diminishing those who advocate for empathy in intellectual discussions. He'd also doubled down on the idea that his academic study was more valuable than Roumie's real-world connection to human experience through his craft. But Shapiro wasn't done. In what would turn out to be the most catastrophic public miscalculation of his career, he decided to drive the knife deeper. You know, Mr. Roumie, I've been debating these issues for over 2 decades. I've written books on legal philosophy. I've argued cases, interviewed countless experts. And in all that time, I've learned that the law isn't a social work manual. It's not therapy, it's law. And law requires expertise, not just passion. The forum was now completely silent. Shapiro had just made a series of devastating mistakes. He'd dismissed Roumie's arguments as emotional rather than substantive. He'd suggested that caring about real people was somehow incompatible with legal expertise, and most fatally, he'd positioned his academic credentials as inherently more valuable than Roumie's practical experience connecting with actual human stories. Roumie sat quietly for a moment, letting Shapiro's words hang in the air. Around the room, you could see people beginning to realize that something significant was about to happen. The audience members supportive of Roumie looked tense but hopeful. The conservative members looked confident but slightly uneasy. The press gallery was completely focused. When Roumie finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and absolutely deadly. "Mr. Shapiro," he began, standing slowly from his chair, "you're absolutely right that the law isn't therapy, but it's also not a philosophy textbook that you get to interpret from the comfort of your office while real Americans suffer from your interpretations." He took a step forward, his voice gaining strength. "You want to talk about expertise? Let's talk about expertise. You've spent years studying what the law says. I've spent years fighting for what it's supposed to do for the human spirit. You've written books about legal theory. I've portrayed people whose very humanity was being violated by legal systems devoid of compassion." The room was electric now. Roumie was building to something and everyone could feel it. "You know what the difference is between your expertise and mine, Mr. Shapiro? Your expertise tells you what the law says on paper. My expertise shows me what the law does to people in practice. And right now, your interpretation of the law is being used to justify a society that often feels cold, uncaring, and profoundly unjust to those who need its protections most." Shapiro tried to interrupt, but Roumie wasn't stopping. "But here's what really bothers me about your lecture, Mr. Shapiro. You sit there with your Harvard degree and your media empire, and you talk about legal expertise like it's some kind of exclusive club that only people like you can join." His voice was rising now, not with raw emotion, but with the kind of controlled intensity that comes from absolute certainty. "Well, let me tell you something about the essence of justice, Mr. Shapiro. It wasn't written just for Harvard Law School graduates. It wasn't written for commentators with fancy degrees. It was written for we the people. All of us, including the people you seem to think are too ignorant or too emotional to understand their own rights or their own suffering." The forum was completely captivated. Roumie had taken Shapiro's greatest strength, his credentials and intellectual prowess, and turned it into evidence that he was fundamentally disconnected from the law's actual human purpose. But Roumie wasn't finished. He leaned forward, looked directly at Shapiro, and delivered the line that would end his political dominance forever. "So yes, Mr. Shapiro, you're right that expertise matters, but maybe, just maybe, the real experts aren't the people who spent years studying the law in libraries. Maybe they're the people who've spent years living under its impact, or fighting to make sure it actually works for the human soul." The room erupted, not in applause. This was a formal debate, after all, but in a kind of stunned murmur that swept through the gallery like a wave. Camera phones that had been discreetly recording were now openly raised. Staff members were frantically taking notes. The moderator, clearly sensing that the forum had just taken a dramatic turn, was staring in shock. But Roumie delivered the killing blow with calm, devastating precision. "Because at the end of the day, Mr. Shapiro, your legal expertise has given us a society that often prioritizes abstract theory over tangible compassion, and a system that works great for people like you, who understand its complexities, but fails people like those I've portrayed, or those who simply seek a basic measure of human dignity. So, forgive me if I'm not impressed by your credentials. I'm more interested in your results, and your results speak for themselves." The camera caught Shapiro's face at the exact moment Roumie's words hit home. The confident smirk was completely gone. His mouth opened slightly as if he was going to respond, but no words came out. His face had gone from its usual pale complexion to a deep red. His hands, which had been confidently gesturing, were now gripping the edge of the table. For a man who had built his entire public identity on never being speechless, Ben Shapiro was completely, utterly speechless. Speechless, he tried to recover. "Mr. Roumie, That's not, the law clearly states, but the words came out in fragments, without his usual smooth delivery. The intellectual who had spent the morning lecturing others about legal principles couldn't form a coherent response to an actor who had just systematically demolished his entire worldview. The other panelists' reactions told the story. The audience members sympathetic to Roumie were trying to hide their amazement and satisfaction. Several were exchanging glances that clearly said, "Did that just happen?" The conservative commentators looked like they'd just watched their star debater get stumped by someone they'd never expected to be a challenge. The moderator, clearly sensing that the forum had just taken a dramatic turn, tried to regain control. "I think we should move on to the next segment," but Shapiro, still trying to salvage his dignity, made one final fatal attempt at a comeback. "Mr. Roumie, I think you're mischaracterizing my position. I never said that empathy has no place. I simply pointed out that legal interpretation requires..." Roumie cut him off with surgical precision. "Mr. Shapiro, the only thing your legal interpretation has required is that real Americans often feel like cogs in a machine, losing their humanity while you write articles about why that's actually good for a logical society. That's not expertise, that's academic malpractice." The forum went dead silent again. Shapiro's face went from red to pale. He opened his mouth one more time, then closed it. For the first time in his public career, Ben Shapiro had no response. The moderator quickly called for a break, but it was too late. The damage was done. In the span of 5 minutes, actor Jonathan Roumie had taken one of American media's most feared intellectual commentators and reduced him to stammering confusion. But this was just the beginning. What happened next would show just how completely Roumie had changed the cultural landscape with his devastating takedown. Within minutes of the forum's break, the political and cultural world exploded. Staff members who had been frantically typing on their phones during Roumie's demolition of Shapiro were now in full crisis or celebration mode, depending on which side of the ideological aisle they worked for. The first clip hit social media before Shapiro had even left the stage. A staffer had uploaded a 90-second video of Roumie's final exchange with Shapiro, focusing on his devastating line about expertise and Shapiro's stunned reaction. Within 15 minutes, hashtag Roumie v. Shapiro was trending nationwide. The original video had been shared over 100,000 times and was climbing fast. But it wasn't just Roumie's supporters celebrating. Even some political commentators, who usually stayed neutral, were calling it one of the most effective intellectual takedowns they had ever witnessed. The comment section was ruthless. Ben Shapiro just got a lesson in humanity from someone who actually portrays it for a living. That wasn't a debate. That was a public execution of intellectual arrogance. Shapiro thought he was facing an actor. Instead, he got schooled by a moral warrior. But the really telling responses came from verified political accounts. Normally, these professional observers stayed measured in their reactions. Not this time. A prominent political journalist tweeted, "In 20 years of covering public discourse, I've never seen a senior intellectual so thoroughly dismantled by a public figure outside traditional political legal circles." Roumie didn't just win that exchange, he redefined it. A prominent ethicist posted, "Roumie just did something remarkable. He took Shapiro's purely academic approach to law and showed why it fails real human beings. This is going to be studied in communication classes." Even some conservative commentators were grudgingly impressed. A conservative legal analyst Faust wrote, "I disagree with Roumie's philosophical leanings, but his takedown of Shapiro was masterful. He turned his greatest strength into his greatest weakness." Shapiro walked right into that trap. Ben Shapiro, meanwhile, was having the worst public day of his career. His staff hustled him off stage and into a private office where they frantically tried to figure out how to respond to what everyone was already calling a career-altering moment. Shapiro's first instinct was to fight back on social media. An hour after the forum, his official account posted, "Jonathan Roumie's performance today demonstrated exactly why intellectual rigor matters. Emotional appeals don't change legal precedent. The law means what it says, not what we want it to mean." The response was swift and brutal. The tweet was immediately ratioed, with replies pointing out that Shapiro had just proven Roumie's point about being out of touch with real people's experiences. The top reply, with over 50,000 likes, read, "Ben, you just spent an hour getting embarrassed by someone you thought was beneath you. Maybe it's time to listen instead of lecture." Realizing that social media was only making things worse, Shapiro's team arranged for him to appear on a friendly political talk show that evening. But even there, the host, normally a reliable Shapiro supporter, couldn't ignore what had happened. Ben, that was a pretty intense exchange with Jonathan Roumie today. His criticism of your approach seemed to really resonate with people. How do you respond to the argument that your intellectual expertise is too theoretical? Shapiro tried to stick to his talking points. Look, legal principles aren't a popularity contest. The founders created a system based on law, not feelings. Jonathan Roumie may be passionate, but passion doesn't change constitutional principles. But even his media allies could see that he was shaken. His usual smooth delivery was gone, replaced by a defensive tone that made him sound exactly like what Roumie had accused him of being, an out-of-touch intellectual who couldn't relate to real human experiences. The interview clips made the rounds on social media, but not in the way Shapiro's team had hoped. Instead of rehabilitating his image, they reinforced Roumie's narrative that Shapiro was fundamentally disconnected from the human impact his legal interpretations affected. But the real significance of Roumie's takedown went far beyond one embarrassing moment for Ben Shapiro. Cultural and political observers began to realize that they had just witnessed a generational changing of the guard in American public discourse. For years, experienced commentators like Shapiro had dominated discussions by wielding their credentials and intellectual knowledge as weapons. They could shut down younger, less traditional public figures simply by questioning their qualifications or their understanding of complex issues. Roumie had just proven that this old playbook was obsolete. He had shown that real-world experience, empathy, and a deep understanding of the human condition could be more powerful than purely academic expertise in legal theory. He had demonstrated that passion for justice and humanity wasn't the opposite of knowledge. It was the point of knowledge. Advocacy groups immediately recognized the significance. The head of a major human rights organization tweeted, "What Jonathan Roumie did today changes everything. He showed that you don't have to be intimidated by credentials when you're fighting for people's dignity. This is what the new generation of public leaders looks like." Even establishment figures, who had sometimes been wary of those who emphasized emotional intelligence, were forced to acknowledge Roumie's rhetorical skill. A senior academic speaking anonymously to reporters said, "That was one of the most effective pieces of communication I've seen in years. He didn't just defend his position, he flipped the entire framework of the debate." Shapiro never saw it coming. On the conservative side, Shapiro's humiliation created a genuine crisis of confidence. If someone with Shapiro's credentials and experience could be so thoroughly dismantled by an actor, what did that say about the effectiveness of their usual intellectual tactics? Some conservative commentators tried to minimize the damage, arguing that Shapiro had simply had a bad day or that Roumie had gotten lucky. But privately, conservative strategists were worried. A GOP consultant, speaking off the record, told a political reporter, "This is a disaster for our side. Shapiro is supposed to be one of our best minds, and he looked completely unprepared for someone who could fight back effectively on a human level. If our intellectual experts can't handle challenges from a more empathetic wing, we're in serious trouble." The concern was well-founded. Within days, other public figures with backgrounds in art, advocacy, or community work were using Roumie's playbook against conservative commentators in different forums. The tactic of turning credentials into evidence of disconnection from real human experience was being deployed across media with devastating effect. Political journalists and analysts spent days dissecting what had happened in that forum. Most concluded that Roumie's takedown of Shapiro represented something much bigger than one memorable public moment. A veteran cultural reporter wrote, "What Jonathan Roumie did to Ben Shapiro wasn't just good rhetoric. It was a masterclass in how to fight back against institutional intimidation. For too long, public figures without traditional academic credentials have been cowed by their more experienced colleagues. Roumie showed that experience connecting with humanity can trump experience studying in libraries." A sociologist at a major university published an analysis arguing that the exchange represented a fundamental shift in American public discourse. Roumie's success against Shapiro shows that the old markers of intellectual authority, academic credentials, years of debate, institutional position, are losing their power to shut down debate. The new generation of public figures is establishing different criteria for expertise: real-world impact, connection to human stories, and effectiveness in advocating for a more compassionate society. In the weeks that followed, the cultural implications of Roumie's demolition of Shapiro became clear. His platform exploded, with millions from across the country rallying to support the actor who had stood up to the intellectual establishment. Advocacy organizations began recruiting spokespeople specifically to run similar campaigns against incumbent commentators who relied too heavily on credentials rather than relatable results. Shapiro, meanwhile, found his public standing significantly damaged. His speaking invitations dried up. Most devastatingly for someone who had built his career on being taken seriously as an intellectual and legal expert, other commentators began challenging his interpretations in ways they never had before, often pointing out the human cost of his purely logical arguments. More broadly, Roumie's success inspired other public figures to be more aggressive in challenging their senior colleagues. The old norms that protected experienced intellectuals from serious criticism began to break down as more people adopted Roumie's approach of turning credentials into evidence of disconnection. For Jonathan Roumie personally, the moment represented the culmination of years of being underestimated because of his profession or his focus on more humanistic themes. In interviews after the forum, he was characteristically direct about what had happened. Ben Shapiro thought he could intimidate me the way he's intimidated other people, he told a reporter. He thought his degrees and his debating experience would shut me up. But I've been dealing with people like that my entire career. People who think their credentials matter more than their results or their impact on human lives. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. He was also clear about what the moment meant for the broader movement of compassionate advocacy. This isn't about me versus Ben Shapiro. This is about a fundamental question. Are we going to let people hide behind their credentials while real Americans lose their humanity? Or are we going to hold them accountable for what their expertise has actually accomplished for the human spirit? As the dust settled from the forum, it became clear that Roumie's takedown of Shapiro had changed something fundamental about American public discourse. The old playbook of using credentials and experience to shut down debate was no longer foolproof. Intellectuals could no longer assume that their institutional authority would protect them from aggressive challenges. For those advocating for empathy and human connection, this was a moment of liberation. They no longer had to accept being lectured by conservative commentators who used their experience as a shield against criticism. Roumie had shown them how to go on offense, how to turn the establishment's greatest strengths into weapons against them. For conservatives like Shapiro, it was a wake-up call. The intellectual tactics that had worked for decades, the appeals to expertise, the condescending lectures, the assumption that credentials automatically conferred authority, were no longer sufficient. They would need to find new ways to defend their positions or risk being systematically dismantled by opponents who refused to be intimidated. Months later, political and cultural observers were still analyzing the impact of those few minutes in a public forum. Roumie's approach had been studied, copied, and adapted by public figures across the country. Communication schools were teaching courses on his rhetorical strategy. Public relations consultants were trying to bottle his approach and teach it to their clients. But perhaps the most significant impact was cultural. Roumie had shown that respect in American public discourse could no longer be assumed based on traditional markers of authority. It had to be earned through effectiveness, connection to constituents, and real-world results that resonated with the human heart. Ben Shapiro remained a prominent commentator, but his public influence was permanently diminished. He became more cautious in debates, less likely to go on the attack against those who appealed to empathy. The confident intellectual who had once dominated public proceedings was replaced by a more hesitant commentator who had learned the hard way that credentials alone weren't enough to win moral battles. Jonathan Roumie, meanwhile, became one of the most sought-after public speakers in the country. His takedown of Shapiro had established him as a master of public combat, someone who could not only hold his own against the most experienced opponents, but completely dominate them. But he remained focused on the larger goal that had driven him that day in the forum. In his final interview about the Shapiro encounter, he made clear what he hoped people would take from the moment. I didn't destroy Ben Shapiro's argument because I'm smarter than him or because I have better credentials. I destroyed his argument because it was wrong and because it was hurting real people. That's what this job is supposed to be about. Not showing off how much we know, but fighting for the Americans who need justice and compassion. The story of Jonathan Roumie's moral triumph over Ben Shapiro became more than just a public moment. It became a symbol of changing American discourse. It showed that the old hierarchies were breaking down, that experience and credentials were no longer enough to win intellectual arguments, and that a new generation of leaders was ready to fight back against institutional intimidation. For anyone who had ever been talked down to by someone who thought their credentials made them untouchable, Roumie's takedown of Shapiro was deeply satisfying. It proved that intelligence, preparation, and moral clarity could triumph over institutional authority and academic arrogance. And for the American public system as a whole, it marked the beginning of a new era, one where public figures would be judged not by their degrees or their years of service, but by their effectiveness in fighting for the people they claimed to represent. The forum that day had witnessed more than just an intellectual argument. It had seen the future of American public discourse, and Ben Shapiro had been left behind. If you enjoyed watching Jonathan Roumie absolutely demolish Ben Shapiro's arrogance, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible public moments. Because in today's landscape, you never know when the next shocking confrontation is going to completely change the game. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in American public life.